Hey, what's going on? Posita here. Today I want to talk about 12 jazz scales that are important for your jazz vocabulary, and I'll also show you the chords that they sound good to play on. Now, the 2-5-1 chord progression is everywhere in jazz. It's also in many styles of music. So what I've done is I've played these scales in the context of a 2-5-1 chord progression. Okay, so you have your scales for your 2 chord, you have your scales for your 5 chord, and you'll also have scales for your 1 chord, whether it's a major or minor chord. Okay, so if you're looking to go all in with your scales, or you're just trying to get your solos to sound a little bit more jazzy and modern, this lesson is for you. Let's dive in. Okay, so there's a couple things to note before we get started, and the first thing is major 2-5-1s sound different than minor 2-5-1s. Okay, so not only are they different chords that are used, but also different scales that will be used. Okay, so a minor 2-5-1 chord progression typically has its own set of scales, and that introduces a different type of tension. Okay, so what I'll do is when I introduce each scale, I'll also tell you which chord progression they sound best on. The second thing I also want to talk about is I'm using a numeric system when I talk about these scales. So you'll hear me say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 1, 2, flat 3, 4. This is like a numeric formula for each scale. I think of numbers for everything, scale degrees. I think of numbers for chord progressions. I highly recommend that you learn the numeric system if you're not familiar with it. The reason being is I do feel it's one of the most effective ways to understand the relationship between chords as well as relationship between the notes that you're playing. All right, so let's get started. Okay, to keep things simple, I'm going to keep everything in the key of C, whether it's C major or C minor. Okay, so for our 2 chords, the first scale that we have is the Dorian scale. This is a very popular scale, and it has these notes: 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. Okay, and back to 1. This works really well over a minor 7 chord. Now, the way you can figure this out, what chord does it work on? All you have to do is just go play every other note of that scale, and that tells you the chord. So if this is my scale, 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 1, I play every other note. Okay, that gives you an arpeggio. When you look at that arpeggio, I have 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7. This is a minor 7. Okay, a minor 7 is typically found in a major 2-5-1. Okay, it's different for a minor 2-5 chord progression, and I'll go over that just shortly. But for a major 2-5-1, typically you'll have a minor 7. Okay, so that's why this scale sounds really good. Okay, you can hear that. The second scale that we have is an interesting one. This is the Locrian Natural 2 scale. It's derived off of the 6th mode of a melodic minor scale, but I do feel it's important to just learn the scale as it is than thinking of modes. It's going to help you be able to apply this knowledge a little bit better. Okay, so the scale notes we have are 1, 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7. It has that sound. If I were to arpeggiate this or play every other note of the scale, I have 1, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7. Interesting. And that outlines a minor 7, flat 5. Okay, so that sound is often used in a minor 2-5-1 chord progression. This sound, this minor 2-5 or chord, sets itself up really well for the 5 chord. And it resolves really nicely to the 1. Okay. The next scale that we have is a Locrian scale, and that's very similar to the last one we just talked about. The only difference is it'll have a flatted 2. Okay, so we have 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7. And if I play every other note or arpeggiate it, I have 1, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7. Okay, that's that minor 7 flat 5 chord again, also known as a half diminished chord. So this scale also sounds really good for your minor 2-5-1s. So those are 3 scales that work really well for your 2 chord. You have 1 scale for your major 2-5-1s and 2 scales for your minor 2-5-1s. Okay, so the next set of scales that we have are for our dominant 5 chords. This is where the real fun begins, because with our 5 chords we can really introduce a lot of tension. The 2 chord is really good for introducing the tension, okay, kind of setting up the tension. The 5 chord, we can now bring in the tension, and then when we finally resolve to the 1 chord, there'll be this really strong sense of release. Okay, so the first scale that we have for our dominant 5 chords is a half-whole diminished scale, and that's created by just a series of half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. When you do that, you end up with what they call a symmetrical scale, and it actually has 8 notes. So it sounds like this. Okay, and that works really well over a dominant 7 chord. Because it's symmetrical, it also ends up having 8 notes. So when I'm going to tell you when I tell you the numbers for this, I'm going to repeat one of the numbers. And so we have the 1, flat 2, sharp 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, flat 7. Okay? So when we arpeggiate this, it's going to be a little bit different, but typically when we arpeggiate, we're just really thinking of 1, 3, 5, and 7. This works really well for your major 2-5-1 chord progression. Okay, so if I start back in the beginning, I talked about the Dorian scale, and then now I play this half-whole diminished. You can hear that resolves really nicely to my 1 chord. All right, the next scale that we have is the altered scale. This is a very popular scale. It's also known as the Diminished Whole-Tone scale, and you'll see why in just a second, but it's perfect for your minor 2-5-1s, okay? So we have 1, flat 2, sharp 2, 3, sharp 4, sharp 5, and it goes right to flat 7 at that point. Okay, so this shape right here, very diminished. After that, it's all whole steps. I actually find that to be the easiest way to think about this scale. But it's also, and you'll also hear some people say that this scale is the 7th degree of a melodic minor scale. It is, but it's easier to just think of it as a scale in itself. Okay, so if we were to pair these scales, for instance, a Locrian Natural 2 scale for the 2 chord, I have this sound. You hear it leads really, it sets up the tension really nicely. I'm going to play now the altered scale. And that leads very nicely to my minor chord. All right, the next scale we have is a Phrygian Dominant scale. I love the sound of this scale. It has a kind of like an exotic type of sound to it. It's not as tense as the altered scale, but just because it doesn't have as much tension, it doesn't mean it's not as hip. It's still a pretty cool scale. We have 1, flat 2, natural 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. Okay, that's a nice sound to it. Here that resolves very nicely to your 1 chord. Okay, so we can pair that again with, for instance, let's say we pair it this time to the Locrian scale. So we'll play a Locrian scale for the 2 chord, then we're going to play Phrygian Dominant for the 5 chord, and we're going to resolve to a minor. This Phrygian Dominant scale sounds really good for your minor 2-5-1s. Okay, so we have Locrian, Phrygian Dominant, sounds very nice. This brings us now to our 1 chords. For our 1 chord, we have a major scale, which is a scale that we've probably all heard, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And the notes are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, so let's hear how that sounds with these scales that we've just learned. We have our 2 chord, we're going to play a Dorian scale. Our 5 chord, we're going to play a half-whole diminished scale. So we have Dorian. And then I'm going to now descend on a half-whole diminished scale, but I'm just going to voice lead. You hear how nice that sounds? And that's just playing the scale. I'm not even actually doing anything interesting with that. Okay, the next scale we have for our major scale is a Major Bebop scale, and it's basically the same thing as a major scale, but we insert a chromatic note between the 5 and the 6. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sharp 5, 6, 7. This is also known as Barry Harris's Major 6 Diminished scale. But the cool thing about this scale is that you can play this scale up and down in a scalar fashion and always keep your chord tones on a strong beat. So that's the purpose of inserting that chromatic note. Okay. The next scale we have is a Melodic Minor scale, and this is for your minor 2-5-1s. We have 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Alright, so let's hear what that sounds like with your Locrian Natural 2 scale for your 2 chord, altered dominant scale, or altered scale for your dominant 5 chord, and then resolving to your melodic minor scale. I'm going to voice lead these scales too as well so you can hear what that sounds like. So we have going to our altered scale. That's a really nice sound. And that's a popular sound too as well. After that we have a Barry Harris's minor 6 diminished scale. Same concept that we did with the major scale, but we're gonna insert that chromatic note between the 5 and the 6. So your melodic minor scale, basically insert chromatic. Okay, so that's 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, sharp 5, 6, 7, 1. And that accomplishes the same exact thing. It allows you to play up and down the scale, but also keep your chord tones on a strong beat. That's 10 scales that I just went over. There are 2 more scales that are really not so much for a 2-5-1 chord progression, but they're really more for a blues chord progression. Blues chord progressions are used in so many styles of music, and it's also used in jazz too as well. So we have a blues scale, and then we have a blues scale plus a major third, which is the same kind of scale, but we're just adding a major third. Okay, the blues scale works over the entire blues chord progression, so you would just use the same scale over the entire chord progression. Okay, so if we are in the key of C, the blues scale would be 1, flat 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, flat 7, 1. And that is the blues scale. Go to the 4 chord. Okay, so that works really well. Okay, so our last scale that we have is our blues scale plus a third. That works really well for your 1 chord and your blues chord progressions. But we have 1, flat 3, 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, flat 7, 1. A lot of chromaticism here. Okay, so we have our 1 chord to a 5. Okay, so that's 12 scales that are important for your jazz vocabulary. I hope you found something useful today. If you did, please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video.